Hey guys, it's Zion here with HobbiesofaMan once again, and today we are doing another comic book review. Today we're going to be looking at something slightly different. This is a collection of daily news strips, or daily comic strips, as well as some Sunday strips. And specifically, this is Johnny Comet by Peter DePaulo, actually someone called Earl Baldwin, and Frank Frazetta, right? So if you're a fan of Frank Frazetta, you might want to look into this, right? So this is published by Vanguard, and I actually reached out to them to ask them a question I had about the book, and they answered the question, so I will mention it here in a moment. And they also sent me this promotional artwork that they made. So I will show it to you guys now. And well, it looks pretty good, right? So I think they did a great job with that artwork, and they also did a great job with this book. And I will show you guys this book much more clearly in detail with a top-down kind of view, so that you guys can see some of the great elements here. But I want to go through the book facts quite quickly here before we do that, right? And then we'll come back after I show you the actual product to discuss the plot lines, right? So let's finish up with the book facts, right? So in terms of demographics, I guess this is technically an all ages demographic. Like, nothing about this is insanely adult or anything like that. I mean, it says here in the front, there's seduction and crime and, passion and terror. But this is like a 1920s or like 1950s type of, level of stuff, right? So it's pretty mild by today's standards. There is some level of sexiness or of seductiveness to some of the poses of the female characters, because that's kind of what Frazetta does. But it's not particularly risque or anything like that. Also, because of the way that this book is set up, I don't think that children read this back in the day. I'm not really sure, right? But I don't think that kids would be interested in it nowadays, right? I think this is more of a teenagers and up kind of thing, and honestly, probably more for adults who are willing to kind of just kind of go along with the flow of something because they like a specific thing about it, right? So yeah, and in terms of genres, this is initially a sports series, a drama series, and ultimately it becomes kind of a slice of life series where, like, part of the slice of life aspect is that these characters go through these really wacky situations, right? So it almost has this kind of like Scooby-Doo vibe to it, where it's like a group of people hanging out, and the way that they hang out is by solving these weird situations, right? And eventually it basically transitions into a comedy strip. However, I don't necessarily think that the comedy aspects are that good. Predominantly, the reason why you should buy this is because you like the artwork, because it's Frank Frazetta stuff, and this is more or less his earliest work that is available, and is collected in a really great edition. And secondly, because you're interested in looking at comic books that are not about superheroes, right? And you're interested in the history of comic books in the United States. If you like those things, this is for you. If you're not really interested in that stuff, you might want to skip this book. This book might not be for you. However, at this point, this book is $20 at most stores that I've seen it at. That's how much it cost me when I bought it. And that's actually a really great price, because this is actually a $50 book, because it's a hardcover, right? And from the pictures I showed you earlier, there's kind of three different editions of this book. There's the fancy slipcase edition, there's this normal edition, which is the regular hardcover, and then there's also the paperback version. I think that the slipcase one is the best, but I'm happy with this normal one. I actually really like this artwork here in the front. And I think that for the price, this is probably the best thing that you can get, as long as it's within that $20 price range that I've seen it at for like 3 years, right? So I recommend you guys check it out. I think it's enjoyable if you like those things that I mentioned earlier. And in terms of adaptations, I don't think it has any. I don't necessarily think this is popular enough to really warrant making an adaptation of it at the time. And at this point, it's 70 years removed from the cultural consciousness, from the zeitgeist. So it's very unlikely that this would ever get turned into anything. However, a Johnny Comet movie that focuses on Johnny Comet, his love life with Jean, what's her name? With Jean Fargo. And it has this really interesting, like racing vibe to it. Would be pretty cool. And I guess I'm just kind of more or less like defining, you know, Rush or Ford versus Ferrari or some other, like, you know, sports movie that's already out there. But I think that it'd be pretty cool, especially if you made it like a period piece. I think that that would be pretty fun and interesting. So I would like to see something based on this IP or based on this, you know, idea, but it's pretty unlikely that it will ever get made, right? So, and in terms of rating for me, well, I would kind of consider this like a 4 out of 5 if I'm feeling generous. But probably, if I'm being kind of harsh, I would say this is like a 3 out of 5 or a 3.5 out of 5 because I love the artwork and I like some of the storylines. But I didn't love it. Like, I didn't like think that this was the greatest thing ever. And I wasn't expecting to feel like that, so it met my expectations. It's just that my expectations were low to begin with, and it having met them makes it like a 3 or a 3.5 out of 5, right? So there you go. And in terms of a premise here, basically, Johnny is a racer, right? And he had this accident in the first couple strips, and he decides that racing is no longer for him, at least at the moment, right? And so he buys a little used car. He works it like into a better shape, and then he decides to go off, you know, driving around, taking this like mobile garage, you know, idea with him, right? So he's driving his car around. He gets somewhere, and he kind of gets pulled into this crazy situation, puts down roots in this place, and then these crazy situations just continue to happen to him throughout this story, right? So it feels like there was a lot of fluidity with how this story was being told. And, you know, maybe the initial concept of, you know, this guy going town to town fixing cars for people might have been a more kind of like cool story. But at the same time, that story that we got with that initial premise and then turning Johnny into this kind of like problem solver for this little group of people also works quite nicely. It's just like sometimes not that exciting, right? So yeah, that's it for that. I want to transition over to the other view that I mentioned so that I can show you what this book is like and the question that I asked Vanguard and the answer that they gave me, and show you a little bit more of the book, right? So I'll do that now. Okay, so here's a closer look at the book here. So you can see it's quite large. Let me see if I can show you compared to a regular comic book how big this book is, right? Here's a normal comic book. This is significantly larger, as you guys can see. This is more of a European style size book, right? So if you have like Black Sad or Enrico Marini's Noir Burlesque and stuff like that kind of size, right? And like I mentioned, this is Frank Frazetta's earliest comic book work that is like actually collectible. This is the standard hardcover, and let's just like take a flip through here, right? So here's the contents page, a bit of a foreword, features, historical essays, and then the bonus Sundays here, which are the other half of the Johnny Comet stuff, right? So it's kind of just an introduction about Frank Frazetta, you know, who he is and stuff. And then we transition over to this quite quickly, January 28th, 1952 to January 31st, 1953. I also want to mention that the stock of the paper here is phenomenal. This is so thick, well laminated. It's very, very good. And well, here we go. So this is the start here. As you guys can see, we have some information here at the top. So the title of the strip, when it was released, and who wrote it. And actually, Peter DePaulo is you know, said to be the writer, but that's not actually true. This was a publicity stunt here. It was actually written by someone else. I can't remember his name. Something Baldwin, Earl Baldwin, I think. And, well, you kind of go through, you know, these stories, right? And generally, they're quite well done. They're super well scanned. You know, you don't have any problems here, at least as long as the originals didn't have any issues, right? At some point, we can start noticing, right, like, you know, this sort of stuff, like the lettering isn't exactly correct in terms of, like, alignment. And you know, the thickness of stuff sometimes is a bit odd. But generally speaking, there really is no problems here. I actually quite liked it. I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I think the artwork is phenomenal. the recreation here is great for these daily strips, at least, right? So yeah, eventually I started noticing that, as you can see, sometimes information isn't provided. And I actually contacted Vanguard, the publisher here, and I asked them about it. I was like, why is there sometimes, information that's either given incorrectly or shown differently from other times, right? And basically, the answer they gave me is as follows. So the black and white strips were scanned at super high resolution. They give a number, which is 5,000 DPI, or something pixels per inch. I can't remember what the D stands for. And they were all basically from Frank's original drawings, right? From his original proofs. However, this isn't really possible for later on in the book when we have these, right? These were more or less tracked down from individual newspapers and then scanned individually. And that's why there's a lot of yellowing and stuff. And although it looks pretty consistent in general, sometimes there is better scanning than other times, right? But these are more like, these look how they would have looked originally, whereas these might be slightly different from what they might have actually looked like in the paper, right? So yeah, if you see any smudges and stuff, that's basically because that's how the paper looked when it was scanned. It's not necessarily a printing issue. I mean, sometimes there might be some situations where you can clearly say it's like a printing issue, but like if you look at stuff like this, right? This is like smudged. It's unclear what it is, but it's not like that the ink here was done incorrectly. It's that there's variation because of the way that they stamped this in place, right? So keep that in mind as you're kind of looking through this stuff. I mean, why things look the way they are. It's not that big of a deal. Like, you probably won't notice it all that often, but to me, it was really annoying that these things were inconsistent, and that's why I asked about it. I was like curious if it was an issue with their editorial process or what, but it turns out that it was just, that's how they did it in the newspaper, that's how they recreated it, and then there you go. And then I mentioned later on in the story that, the strip actually turns into Ace McCoy, right? And that happens because of a specific situation that occurs during the strip, right? So I'm not gonna talk about it right now. We get this really abrupt ending to the strip here, and then we continue on to more writings. These are in essay format, talking about the work that Frazetta did, right? So here we're talking about Buster Crabbe, which is more or less his earliest work here, and you can see it's phenomenal. And then here we see some other characters that Frazetta worked on. I think this was supposed to be Thunda or Durango Kid. I'm not really sure. I can't remember. Then here we talk about the baseball aspect that he was just doing. And then here, some more great stuff. I think this is my favorite page total in the whole book, right? I just think this looks phenomenal. This is supposed to be some sort of like Tarzan-esque, island survival type thing. Then we get a little bit of a taste here at the Little Abner stuff. I really want to get this this collection, the Little Abner Frank Frazetta years collection, because this stuff looks great. And I really love how he did the artwork here. Apparently, this was a collaboration where Frank Frazetta basically did everything, and then Al Cap would show up and then finish up the faces so that it would look consistent across what he's done before. And I think that that's really interesting and kind of weird, right? Here's some more individual moments. And then here we have some of the Johnny Comet Sunday strips that are done in black and white before they were colored in. And I think they look even better like this than when they look like colored in, right? So yeah, and I think that's because the colors add these like interesting shadows that make these characters look a bit older than they really are supposed to be, right? So yeah, and then we start the Sunday strips, and like I showed you before, these are all just in color, and I think that uncolored, black and white, they look even better. But there's something really nostalgic almost, although I'm nowhere near 100 years old, or like 80 years old, or however old you have to be to have seen this in your childhood. I'm nowhere near old enough to be that nostalgic about these things, but there's something great about this, like how this looks. This has such a beautiful vintage touch that is quite enjoyable, right? Even with the yellowing, which is not my favorite. I really dislike this, like, you know, line of yellow across everything. But I mean, it's not the fault of the publisher. That's just kind of how it is. Even with that, these things look great, right? We can see he did a bit more simple style here. And then, I mean, that's basically all there is to say about this, all there is to show you. This strip also ends kind of just abruptly. And that's the end of the book, right? And so, overall, I think that this book is phenomenal. It's immensely worth your money and your investment and your time, as long as you are more interested in the artworks than the story. Because, to be honest with you, although the stories can be quite funny sometimes, they're not necessarily super involved. And, you know, the idea kind of, like, the presentation kind of gives a wrong impression. This isn't really a racing strip. This is a strip about a guy that used to be a car racer that ends up getting into shenanigans, usually of the dealing with criminals type, that sometimes involves a car, right? And so don't expect there to be a lot of racing here. It's mostly about seduction, crime, passion, and terror, right? It's about that stuff. But because it's from the 50s, it's pretty tame in comparison to what we think of as seduction, crime, passion, and terror nowadays, right? So this is a great book for its historical value, for the fact that it collects Frank Frazetta's earliest works in a great way, right? And if you're interested in that, I recommend it. So those are my kind of general thoughts about the book here. I'll come back to the rest of the video so that you guys can see me actually review the content of the book, right? So I'll see you guys in the next segment. And now that we're back from that other viewpoint, I want to talk about the plot line here, right? So essentially, there's kind of two major divisions in the storytelling here, right? So there's the dailies, and then there's the Sunday strips, right? And they both each start as a Johnny Comet strip, and then they turn into Ace McCoy, right? And so I will talk about the dailies first, and I will give you a general overview of all of the plot lines that happen here, right? And I'll call them arcs because that's kind of like the setup that I'm used to from talking about manga. And then I'll show you basically all of the arcs that are in the Johnny Comet dailies, and then I'll talk about the Ace McCoy arc for the dailies, and then we'll transition over to the Sunday strips. I'll talk about the Johnny Comet Sunday strips arc, and then I'll talk about the Ace McCoy section, right? And then we'll discuss the characters, the art, and the rating, and all of that stuff, right? So let's get started here with the dailies. Basically, we get introduced to Johnny with all of that stuff that I mentioned earlier. You know, he's racing, he crashes, and he decides to move on to something else, right? And so he takes his car, he fixes it up, and he paints onto the car. He says, you know, this is Johnny's mobile garage, right? And so he moves on and he drives around California. Eventually, he makes it to Clover, where he meets Ma and Pop, who are these old, couple that basically are in charge of this gas station that also has this like large, like area inside it that is like kind of their house and kind of like a lodging area and all sorts of things that kind of all fit in this one place, so that we have like a central place where all of the characters meet, right? And so he basically sets down in this little town of Clover. He meets Mom and Pop. He meets Gene Fargo and Mom and Pop's little buddy friend that I can't remember the name of. Let me see. I think it's over here. Yeah, and Sparky. And Sparky, I think, is a co-worker of Pop. And he and Pop both work for Gene Fargo. And Gene Fargo is the main female character of the story. And she's kind of like the pairing for Johnny, right? So Johnny and Gene Fargo have this kind of interesting will they, won't they kind of relationship throughout the whole strip. Eventually kind of realize that they are going to be together, but the strip kind of ends abruptly, and so we kind of don't really get a good, situation on that. We don't really understand the final kind of like element to their story, but we kind of understand, okay, they ended up together, right? And basically, this is where we start the first arc, right? And this arc is the Al Gore arc, which deals with this old bad guy trying to destroy Gene's car. And he's trying to do this because Gene's car is faster than his. And he said that his car had a special atomic carburetor or something, which is all bullshit. It's all fake. And so he needs to beat Gene's car to show that his car is fast, to say that it's because of this carburetor, and then sell these fake carburetors to other people so that he can make money off of it, right? It's a really convoluted scheme. And so he's trying to get rid of Gene Fargo's car, and the people that he hires basically also want to kill Gene and Johnny Comet, right? And so this is a dangerous situation. It all gets resolved and then transitions over to the basically the next arc here, which is when Colonel Rocket shows up. He sees Johnny and he's like, dude, you're amazing. I want you to be my race car driver so that I can finally get my racer to win this, you know, special cup or whatever. And it's like his live stream. But the thing is that his daughter is dating the guy that currently drives for him, right? And so his daughter decides to try to get rid of Johnny any way possible. And this causes Johnny and Gene to have some friction there, but also kind of ends up with Johnny having to deal with this, you know, seduction and crime kind of element of the story, right? And so this is also quite fun. It kind of wraps up pretty easily as well. And then we get introduced to, I think his name is Jason Fig. And this is a character that is actually from Ma and Pop's past. Apparently he used to be Ma's old sweetheart, her old boyfriend before she married Pop. And he's actually kind of a swindler, right? And so this is another storyline here, which basically ends up with Johnny having to figure out what the hell's going on, right? And so we kind of go through this one, and this one's actually quite short, so there really isn't too much to say here. And then this transitions over to this other like crime-related situation here with this other kind of swindler people or person, sorry, who is named Ida, right? Or Ida, I guess. I think Ida is the right way to say it in English, and it would be Ida in Spanish, right? So Ida is this woman in her 40s, and she's trying to kind of get Ma and Pop to be compassionate with her and to help her get out of this situation that she kind of made up, right? And then it turns out to be fake. Eventually, Johnny's trying to help her when he realizes what the hell's going on, and so then they kind of turn her into the police, and we kind of get this you know, resolution to this, right? And at this point, you guys can kind of see that this is very like Scooby-Doo-esque, right? It has that same kind of vibe to it, where there's like a quick situation, there's a character that's introduced, and quite quickly you understand that this character is also the bad guy, and you kind of go through this rinse and repeat kind of several times over, right? So in general, it's quite enjoyable. It's just not like super exciting by today's standards, right? But it's quite fun. Like it is nice, and it's an easy thing to do. And because of the way that the daily strips are set up, you can just read one and then forget about it for a while and come back and read another one, or you can kind of binge read them all quite quickly, right? And so it's a nice way to read this. It's a nice way to set up everything. And in general, I like it, right? So yeah, it's just like not exciting, right? So after Ida, we kind of start getting into the Hollywood aspect here, which is kind of basically the last arc here in the Johnny Comet aspect of the dailies, right? And so they go to Hollywood because there's this casting director. He sees Johnny. He's like, dude, you're fucking awesome looking and you know how to drive. Let's get you in here into being one of the movie stars. Turns out that the guy that is actually in charge of the movie, the actual director, doesn't want Johnny to be in charge, and so he makes him be the stuntman. Johnny is like okay with it. He's like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. As long as we're in Hollywood, it's all good, right? And then a lot of convoluted kind of things happen, and basically Johnny ends up in the hospital. And this is when the daily transitions over to being an Ace McCoy, right? And so this is basically because Johnny needs to kind of change his name to kind of become a different person so that he can kind of restart his Hollywood career that kind of he didn't really ever have, right? And so at this point, the story kind of transitions away from, you know, this like drama slice of life stuff into more of a comedy bit by having the same kind of setup as before, just kind of focusing more on like, you know, more simple things, right? And well, it kind of works and it's pretty fun, but it kind of ends up finishing up really quickly, just kind of like out of nowhere. There's a final strip that's like, oh, where the hell is Gene Fargo? Oh, she's in Hollywood doing really good. We're going to go do this thing. And, you know, it turns out that she's off with some other guy. And then Johnny steps in, and then, you know, the strip ends. And the next page is like Johnny and Gene Fargo lived happily ever afterwards, right? And well, it's kind of disappointing that it kind of ends there, right? Then there's this part of the book here that's actually talking about how this book was constructed, where they got all of the information, how Frank Frazetta did all of his work, some of his favorite strips from his time working on this, and, a bunch of different stuff, right? And, there's mentions of, like, some of his earliest work. There's mentions about how some of that stuff isn't really easy to, kind of find. And quite a plethora of good information here that I really enjoyed reading. Like, this was probably my favorite part of the book because it was really insightful in a way that was good, right? And then we transition over to the Sunday strips. And the Sunday strips are in color. I think most of them are in color, if not all of them. I think all of them are in color. Yeah, I think they are all in color. And they're basically more or less starting off, assuming that you know the introduction arc to Johnny Comet, right? So when he crashes and he moves on to Clover, right? So it basically starts right afterwards, right? And it starts with this guy who comes into this gas station to try to avoid danger. And it turns out that this guy is from this other city called Brookvale. And he's this little old guy that's trying to figure out what's going on at his racing track, right? And they solve his issue, and then they move on to another story. And basically, at this point, it transitions again to a second version of Ace McCoy. And there's a story about this motor dome, which is just like a bowl, and then they ride a car sideways around it because it's interesting and dangerous, right? And this is quite similar to one of the earlier stories. In fact, it's almost kind of beat for beat the same, except the artwork is a little bit better here. However, I think that the colors are actually detracting from Frank Frazetta's work, right? And I think that his work on the dailies is a little bit more interesting to look at because it doesn't have any color, so you can really appreciate all of the line work, right? Whereas the ones in color technically look better because, color adds more texture to stuff and it makes it more interesting, but it kind of muddies the line work a little bit. Also, the Sunday strips were not scanned directly. They were kind of like they had to be scanned from copies that were kind of yellowed and not that well treated, right? And so you can kind of see a dip in the quality of the scans at this point, even though the scans are probably done at the same like high value of like pixelation or whatever. Whatever the measure is, like DPI, right? But because of the actual deterioration of the actual pages, it looks a little bit worse than the dailies, right? So yeah, but the story is good and it's enjoyable. And then it ends up with this final story about saving this girl from this crappy stepmom kind of thing. And then a few little humor strips that were not that funny. And a lot of them kind of focused on this like, oh, men are better than women, but then the guys are doing the same thing, and so it's ironic, right? And so that's supposed to be funny. And to an extent, it can be funny, but it doesn't really work in these strips because the joke is kind of very basic, and there's not enough time spent on it to kind of, flesh it out into something funny. Like, there is no, like, setup and then punchline. It's just kind of like the punchline is that, the whole thing, right? And that's not particularly humorous, right? And so that basically ends the story and it ends the book, and that's all there is to kind of appreciate in this Johnny Comet collection in terms of story. And I didn't really give you all of the details of everything, so it shouldn't be too hard to enjoy this after watching this video. Like, I gave you some general spoilers, but it's not so bad that you'll like not find anything interesting in the story. I think that there's quite good stuff, like, the interaction between characters and stuff is enjoyable, and the artwork is good, and, all of the racing scenes are great. So don't think that I spoiled everything and that I ruined your experience. It's not really like that. A lot of this is pretty simple, and so I just gave you kind of like the basic idea of each of the stories, right? So yeah, in terms of characters, we have Johnny and Jean Fargo and Sparky and Ma and Pop Bottle, and we get a bunch of ridiculous bad guys, and sometimes they're accompanied by hot, young ladies that Frank Frazetta likes to draw. Johnny is basically a self-portrait of Frank Frazetta throughout most of this, and that's kind of cool. Also, it's a little bit weird because it's like a interesting kind of like thing to like self-insert yourself into this type of story. Not that readers don't do it, but like it's kind of interesting to like so clearly see it from the artist's perspective, right? So it's kind of fun and interesting, but it's also a little bit weird sometimes. And it's really interesting because, you know, the young people have this like really great style to them. And then most of the old people kind of have this like cartoony, kind of like exaggerated vibe to them that looks really great regardless. But it's kind of funny that, you know, the old people look exaggerated and then the young people look quite, you know, realistic. And it's kind of interesting to see that balanced out. And sometimes the artwork is not as great as other times. That's just because of the nature of how they were doing this, but in general, it's quite enjoyable. So yeah, that was the art. What else is there to say? The Sunday strips are not as good as the dailies because of the yellowing of the actual pages that they scanned. The colors are not bad, but they're not really my favorite either. And I think that the black and white stuff is probably the best, right? And the two best strips in the Sunday strips are actually shown to you in black and white in that kind of transitionary set of pages that I mentioned earlier. So you can get to appreciate them in both formats, which is nice. I like that. And then in terms of a rating, like I said, it's a 3.5 out of 5, 4.5 out of 5. A 3.5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5. In general, it's quite good stuff, but mostly because of the artwork, not necessarily the storytelling, right? Otherwise, if you notice some issues, and I should have talked about this in the showcase portion of this, if you notice any issues with the printing, 99.99% sure that is issues with the original pieces of paper that were scanned and not actually the printing quality of this book. Because actually, Vanguard did a great job with that. Their quality control is good. The way that they did things is good. And then based on the information they told me, basically anything that you see, any imperfections that you see in the scans or in the actual like strips and stuff is exactly and honestly due to the fact that that's just what the actual page looked like when they scanned it, right? So there you go. Overall, pretty good stuff. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was enjoyable because of the artwork. I thought it was fun in terms of the story sometimes, but not other times. And in general, I think that it worked out pretty well. I liked it a lot. I'm happy with it. So happy, in fact, that I want to buy the second Vanguard volume. There's another one. This one collects the Sundays and daily strips that Frank Frazetta worked on, at least for the Johnny Comet series. The other one that Vanguard has focuses on another series of Frank Frazetta's called The White Indian. And this is a series that seems familiar to me from what I've seen from some Mexican comic books before. There was this other story about this, like, I can't remember what it was called. It was like Golden Eagle or something, Águila Dorada. I can't remember the name of it, but it's quite similar. It's about this person that was not a Native American that ended up with the Native Americans and became assimilated into their culture, right? And I think that that's what The White Indian is about. And it looks pretty interesting and cool. So I really want to get that edition. However, I want to have another hardcover edition because if I'm only going to have these two books from this publisher, I want them to be in the same style, right? However, it seems pretty hard to find a hardcover edition of this White Indian series. So I'll probably have to get the paperback and then hopefully one day find a hardcover edition that I can kind of trade in for, right? So I will hopefully do that, and I want to kind of do that by June because I want to read it as part of my June on the Range set of books, right? But I'm not really sure that will be possible. Hopefully it is. In general, I think that this book is fun. I think that Vanguard did a great job with it, and I recommend you guys check it out. If you're interested in Frank Frazetta, you're interested in old comics, and you're interested in kind of reading something that's not really like anything that's out right now, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you thought. And thank you guys very much for watching. See you guys later.